Some of you may be looking at this object that we're going to be drawing here, and you may be thinking to yourself, well, we've gone back to kindergarten, because that's basically just a box. And you're right, it's definitely just a box. Some of you may be thinking, no, he's not gone off the deep end. There's some little intricate details in there. There's like a grid of little holes here, and no, we're going to be ignoring those holes because we don't care about them. They're detail. We're still talking about construction. The reason that we're looking at such a simple object is because it has two main things that I want to talk about. First off is the obvious one, or at least somewhat more obvious. It's got this little button here that is positioned in the horizontal center and a little bit lower vertically. But basically, we're going to look at techniques that we use to align that within this face. And then the second thing that we want to look at is the fact that it's got nice beveled edges. So it's not straight, it's not a sharp corner, it's nice and rounded. And there are some elements to that that I want to discuss that a lot of students tend to take too lightly. So first, let's move this thing over to the side. And we start off with a box, as one might assume. You're basically constructing this box without your vanishing points. You know, you should know where they're going to be, but you don't have to plot them in the page. The thing is, if you do plot them in the page, you're going to be implying, because they're going to be so close together, you're going to be implying a certain sense of scale that really shouldn't be applied to an object this big. Because with your vanishing points in the frame, the convergences will be so dramatic that it'll be implying really large scale, or that the object is very close to you, and you don't really want either of these to be the case. So we've got a fair bit of time before these lines start converging in any noticeable fashion. They are still converging, it's just not dramatic at all. It's quite shallow. So next, we want to look at how we're going to position this button. And in order to do that, we are going to subdivide. We're going to subdivide all of these planes. And initially, this looks kind of confusing, but basically, as I've probably explained in other videos, if you have a plane in space and you draw diagonal lines from corner to corner, where those lines intersect will be the center of that plane. So that can be quite useful. Next, we create, or at least we find, these center lines. And the key to this is that they're passing through the center that we've defined, and they're also running towards the same vanishing points as other lines of this box. So for example, these three lines should be converging towards the same vanishing point. And these three lines should be converging towards the same vanishing point as well. Now, we are eyeballing it, so you're not going to get it 100% perfect every time. So you do have to be aware of something that I mentioned in the advanced boxes exercise video, that as you do this, you're going to get a lot of accumulation of mistakes, and you need to be able to compensate for that as you go. That advanced boxes video is basically all about subdivision and these errors that accumulate. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, be sure to check that out. So next, I do want to jump over to the beveled edges a little bit. And what I'm doing here is I'm kind of establishing these lines, and it's basically going to be where the box goes from having a straight plane to suddenly turning. And so we can kind of pin that down to these two locations. The actual curve falls between this section. We're not going to care about the curve for a little bit. Instead, we want to establish this as a sort of flat cut that's come across this edge. And there's a very specific reason for why we want to deal with flat edges and sharp corners for as long as we can. The reason for this is that a curve is inherently the summarization of many different configurations of straight edges. So that could be, if you're looking at this curve, It could be suggesting this trajectory. It could also be suggesting this trajectory. And really, the number of options are infinite. A curve is like, it's like a vague answer. And if you remember back to what I've talked about construction a lot, where every phase of construction is answering some sort of a spatial question or solving a spatial problem. And a curve is or at least a curve drawn just arbitrarily is going to be a vague answer to those questions. Because of that vagueness, if you leave your curves just to behave that way, your constructions are going to feel less solid because you don't have clear answers to all those questions, and so it ends up feeling a little bit flimsy. We can get away with this quite a bit when we're dealing with organic forms, just because of the nature of the objects. Organics lean into these curves, and they have those kinds of gradual accelerating curves that are smooth and they flow well, and that really just, it's not something that gets hindered by the fact that they're vague answers. There are still cases, however, where we look at the planes of a face. So we're actively looking at chiseling off chunks and being more precise and more direct, even though ultimately we're going to round out those forms later. That's exactly what we're doing here. We're taking a harsh cut to this corner, cutting it clear like this, and later on we'll build our curve into that. But because we're dealing with those clear answers first, when we round it out, it will feel much more solid. Before we do that, though, let's look at transferring this, the distances or the sizes of these cuts over to the opposite ends of our box. So as you can see here, I've employed the technique of mirroring a position across the center of a plane. So in order to do that, first we find our center, then whichever line we actually want to make, we'll just draw that in, and I want to transfer this to somewhere on this side so that this distance is equal to whatever distance is here, and this distance is equal to this one. And so because we're in perspective, we can't simply measure this and just measure that out over here, because, you know, the farther end is going to be smaller and the closer end is going to be larger. So instead, what we do is we draw a line from this point here, where our line hits the top of this plane, and we pass it through the middle of the plane. And we can do it on the opposite side too. And this doesn't have to be done in this case because the plane is just flat and orthographic. But if you're in perspective, and especially three-point perspective where you've got three vanishing points, you will probably find it a lot easier than estimating your convergences. So here you have now a point on the top and the bottom of the plane, and you can draw that directly. Now, we can be guaranteed that this size here is equal to this one. And so they're mirrored right across this central axis. So that's what we've done here. You can see these red lines coming down and up. And we found that this line was the mirrored version of it. And so that's one side of our bevel. Next here, I'm just transferring it over by using the simple drawing lines that converge towards the same vanishing point. So the same way we estimate our convergences, I've done that here to draw a line across. And now I've basically done that all around, creating this slice that you can see in red. Now I can do my straight cuts along this front, here, 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 and here. And we'll deal with curving those out a little bit later. Once again, I'm doing the exact same thing where I'm first mirroring this cut here, this line, across the center of this plane to find this line here, as well as this one. And then we're doing the exact same thing again where we apply the convergence of the lines to estimate where this end is going to be. And so it's basically a combination of those two tricks. Some of these we can just mirror them across the plane. Others we don't. It's going across two different planes, and so we're just going to estimate the convergence with the other lines towards our vanishing point. Now I want to position my button. So I do know that this button it's pretty square, and it is resting along the bottom section of this plane. So I could probably estimate, I'm not actually sure if the top of the button is sitting against the center line of this plane. You could maybe make that assumption, but I didn't really want to make that call. You can actually check it right on the reference image. So we'll do that right now. But in the actual drawing, I have not made that assumption. It does appear to be roughly around the center line, so that would have been useful information. I eyeballed it, and I just put one line, one vertical line, and then I mirrored it across, same as before. And in this case, I just drew two converging lines parallel, or at least converging towards the same vanishing point as the top and bottom of this plane. Then I inset a plane inside of this kind of rectangular or squarish cut. And the way that I did that was I had the center cross already. Or no, I didn't. I drew that in. So I did the center technique where you do the diagonals. And I picked a distance in on this cross. And I just drew down to the next line and then across to the next diagonal and up and across again. And that gave me a pretty reasonable space inside. I was actually a little bit less than accurate, but oh well. Now, it's actually pretty simple. Once you've got a sort of cut, you can round that out pretty easily by staying as close to it as you can. You want your lines to diverge from these straights just slightly at the corner and then return to it. So if I were to show you a single corner like this, most of the time we're staying along this line and this line, and we're only slightly diverging from it to create a smooth curve right along the corner. It's a fairly tight curve, and if we wanted to make a wider curve, we could do that by simply having more straight lines involved. So we're staying along here, and then we're slightly coming along to the next one, and then the next, and so on. And so it stays fairly close to that curve. And the reason that I want you to do this is because when you move too far from your initial curve, from your initial lines rather, say we were doing this, that's when you get into vague territory. Visualization in the long run will be enough to be able to construct your curves confidently and in a way that feels solid, because you'll be visualizing exactly the closer lines that are along it. But until you reach that point, I want you to be mapping these all out as straight lines first, and then try and adhere to them as closely as you can. Don't go making, arbitrary curves that just could represent anything. As you practice this, you'll be able to understand where those straight lines for every curve actually rest, and you'll be able to see them in your mind's eye, or at least understand where they are in a more abstract fashion. And this will allow you to create curves that are more consistent within the space. It really comes down to when you're thinking between 2D and 3D, because when you're drawing an arbitrary curve, you're inclined to think about how that curve flows on the page itself. But when you're dealing with straight lines, perspective immediately comes into play. And so when you apply the curve over your straight lines, it's taking some of that perspective understanding, the spatial understanding of 3D space, and it's applying it to your curve in a way that it might not have otherwise. So keep that in mind. Now, the last thing that I'm doing here, well, not the last, but there's a few more detail-based things, but here there are little inset curves along the top here. And I decided I'd go ahead and add those the same way that I did with the button, where I drew, I already had my center found. And I just relied on going from diagonal to diagonal, and in this case I gave it a little bit of a tight curve towards the corners. From here, it's really just a matter of line weight, so I'll get rid of the red. These corners and this cast shadow are the last touches that I put, and you can see that in these, to kind of show the roundedness of this edge, I found that, yeah, you can see a kind of effect like that, but in general, a cylinder actually is probably the best analogy to use. A lot of people will try and, when they're shading a cylinder or applying form shading to it, they'll often try and add little ticks like this, and I generally stay away from it. Reason being, with each and every one, you're creating a little contour curve, but because there's so many, you're more likely to draw them in a way that does not actually follow the surface of the cylinder, and you're more likely to end up flattening it out because you're just drawing relatively straight or shallow curves. Instead, shading it lengthwise is a lot more effective. And what I'll usually do is I will have some really thick, bold lines along here and then let them get thinner towards the outside of this shaded space. And it does help convey the curvature. Usually I don't rely on any kind of form shading, but when you've got a particularly shiny or rounded curve, it can really help to just add that extra little touch of straight, bold, thick lines that come out to be a little bit thinner towards the outside. So that's a pretty handy technique that you can use to help communicate that roundedness a little bit further and really accentuate it. Lastly, I do have this this cast shadow, which I've only drawn as an outline. I've decided that I'm not going to fill it in because I don't think this construction needs to pop anymore. It doesn't really need that extra bold section. So leaving it as a simple outline gives it the grounding that it needs, that it's sitting on a surface, but doesn't draw any more attention. And that's pretty much it. I have skipped the all the circles because I didn't really want to get into that. It would really just be a matter of creating a very tedious grid, applying these subdivision techniques. And frankly, if you were drawing the speaker for the homework for this lesson, I wouldn't really want you to get into that. I mean, you could do the simpler ones down here, but the rest is really just going to take more of your time and not necessarily teach you much in terms of construction. They are, after all, really just details. And I'm more interested in how you're handling these tight corners and how you're subdividing your surfaces to place the larger, the fundamental form objects. And so that's about it. There will be a link to the text breakdown of this demonstration on the Drawabox website, and that'll be in the description below. So be sure to check that out and maybe follow along with the demos so that you can try and apply the techniques that I've demonstrated here.